Mercenaries were coming from the west, told of my disappearance by a man, a betrayer who worked for my father.
Just a couple of months ago, at the end of August, the PlayStation game Fear Effect was quietly re-released on PC and modern consoles. There were a few articles announcing this, but since then it's flown mostly under the radar, and perhaps not without good reason. It's basically a straight port of the original with very minimal tweaks or improvements, and certainly doesn't come close to remaster territory, which might have attracted more interest. Still, it's nice to have the original game at least more easily available. It's considered by some to be a cult classic, and it was certainly one of the wildest, coolest looking, and at times most frustrating PlayStation games I can remember from its era. I figured now would be a decent time to take a look back at it and check out the sequel while I'm at it. Both were released for the PlayStation and developed by Kronos Digital Entertainment, who hadn't found much success beforehand, having developed only a few other games, like the notoriously bad fighting game Criticom and the obscure isometric action game Meat Puppet. Man, what a title. Fear Effect originally came out in the year 2000, and it had some shock value that kicked in before even starting the game, when you opened its case to find a whopping 4 discs. It's not some epic 80-hour JRPG, it actually only takes about 4 hours to finish, so what's on here that's taking up so much space? This was answered immediately once you actually turned on the game and saw its graphics and highly unique visual design. If I had to sum up Fear Effect's presentation in a single word, it would be cinematic, but not in the sense that it's an interactive movie or something similar to that. Fear Effect didn't make sacrifices with its gameplay to achieve its signature style. Instead, one thing it did was use a widescreen aspect ratio like a film back when games still mainly used 4:3. Okay, that's simple and effective, but not what you need 4 discs. You might have already noticed the distinctive look of the character models, which were designed using a technique that appears similar to cell shading. Besides just being awesomely stylish, the characters also look very similar during gameplay as they do during the game's many cutscenes, allowing for smooth transitions that don't break immersion. The game absolutely takes advantage of this by peppering you with lots of brief little cutscenes to go along with the longer story-focused ones, for things like shifting to a new area, completing a puzzle, finding important items, and sometimes showing a character's gruesome death when you mess up and get killed, before taking you to a reload screen. Here's a happy little montage to show you what I'm talking about. What's hogging up all that space on the discs even more than the cutscenes though are the backgrounds. Like some of its notable PlayStation contemporaries, aka Resident Evil, Fear Effect uses fixed camera angles for its environments and utilizes them effectively to create a range of dramatic and expressive perspectives while also adding tension by obscuring what might be lurking up ahead. What's different here though is that instead of still pre-rendered backgrounds, everywhere you go has full motion video or FMV backgrounds. These range from simple flickering lights or moving shadows to much more active scenes that have a lot going on in them. Roaring fires, rippling water, zombie demons going nuts, and whatever craziness is going on here. As a result, Fear Effect's world looks lively and unique, and many of these touches help enhance the mood of places, with things like eerie mists to make an area appear more sinister, or vibrant flashing lights to add a futuristic quality to cityscapes. And it ties into the gameplay too, with clues for puzzles, traps, and even bosses blended in as parts of the backgrounds. The videos do loop, along with the sound effects accompanying them, which is noticeable when you stay on the same screen for a while, and their compression hurts the quality, especially on large modern displays. But these issues aside, it's a really cool and unconventional style, especially when paired with the character models. Sometimes it really looks like you're running around and kicking ass inside of an action cartoon show. I played Fear Effect for the first time back when it came out, but only briefly. I was young and it's pretty hard, which I'll talk about more soon, but even that short time was enough for its visual style to really stick with me and motivate me to revisit it later on. I just hadn't seen anything else quite like it. On top of all this, the actual artwork is well done too, with rich and atmospheric illustrations used in each of the 4 major locations you visit. The first of these is a future version of Hong Kong with a cyberpunk vibe that the creator said was inspired by Kowloon Walled City and Blade Runner. The game begins with 2 of the game's 3 protagonists arriving here to attempt to pull off what is supposed to be a simple job: track down a missing girl and return her to her father, but not out of the kindness of their hearts or some sense of moral duty. They're mercenaries, and kidnapping this girl, whose name is Wei Ming, and then ransoming her back to her powerful triad boss father should earn them a hefty payday. Their casual banter about the job shows their familiarity with this kind of work and helps indicate their status as anti-heroes.
When you're talking about this kind of money, you can lose friends in a hurry. And once we find the girl, we are talking about this kind of money, right, Hana?
Wei Ming Lam is the daughter of the most powerful triad leader in Hong Kong. Don't worry, Glass. If we reach his little runaway first, Lam will pay us handsomely to get her back.
Of course, he'll want us dead as well.
Hannah, her partner Glass, and their Australian buddy Deke, who joins them later on, are no strangers to killing people who get in their way. Which is good, because you need to murder a lot of stuff in this game. Fear Effect clearly took some inspiration from Resident Evil, and while it does have survival horror elements, it's much more of an action game, and probably closer to Capcom's Onimusha series, at least with the amount of action it has. There are plenty of demons and monsters to put down, but you'll also leave a hefty pile of human corpses in your wake. It's true they're all trying to kill you, but since all the shooting is initially motivated by money, it's pretty clear that the main characters aren't your typical good guys trying to save the world.
Glass, I signed on this gig for one reason, right? The money.
We'll still get it.
You switch between controlling each of them at various points throughout the game, which lets you explore different routes through a given area or retread places you've already been under different circumstances, both of which are woven nicely into the story, with characters coming to rescue each other or working together to solve a conflict from multiple angles. Well, if the game is more action than survival horror, what's with the name Fear Effect? That's a reference to your health bar, which isn't technically a health bar, but a fear meter showing the player character's heartbeat. Green and slow for calm, red and fast when they've taken damage and are about to die, and orange for everything in between. I like the idea, but it feels a little like a gimmick because it's still basically a health bar, with the main difference being that instead of using items to restore health, doing things like killing enemies or completing puzzles to calm your character down is how you heal. And running into things that would frighten the player character brings it closer to red. Sometimes. The first boss lowers the meter right at the start of the fight, which makes sense from a narrative perspective because he's a powerful and frightening enemy. However, other bosses raise the meter at the start of the fight, which makes sense from a gameplay perspective because you need more health for a tougher fight. This happens sometimes with regular enemies too, where it'll rise or fall at the start of an encounter, without any clear indication as to why it's behaving differently in similar scenarios. So it seems at least somewhat arbitrary, and I could never really make perfect sense of it, which led me to dismiss it as not much more than a slightly fluctuating health bar. When it comes to the moment-to-moment gameplay, you have a few combat options at your disposal. You can use stealth for quick melee or one-shot insta-kills, run around while shooting on the move, dual wield to shoot multiple enemies at once, duck down or roll around for cover, and on one occasion, distract an enemy. But you're not always given much time to decide which strategy to use because Fear Effect loves to throw you into scenarios where you only have a split second to react. And this is where a good portion of the game's difficulty comes from. A cutscene will end and gameplay resumes with multiple enemies immediately bearing down on you, ready to tear you to pieces, which they can usually do pretty quickly. What makes these moments even more frantic is that cycling through your inventory happens in real time, so you could definitely be in trouble if you don't already have the right weapon out. Also, more enemies can pile in from off-screen or drop down from above just when you think you're safe, and the game uses tank controls. You have some defensive maneuvers like a quick turnaround and somersaulting, but sticky situations can still be tough to maneuver out of if you hesitate. Killing bosses requires precise timing and very specific mechanics, which are sometimes hard to figure out without resorting to trial and error. There are also more than a few difficult and deadly traps where you can die instantly, and a decent amount of puzzles requiring careful attention or some brain power to solve. All of this might sound like a recipe for blood-boiling frustration, and sometimes it can be. There are a lot of well-placed save points, but the recent re-release goes a step further by adding quick save and rewind features, and not without good reason. A first-time playthrough is almost guaranteed to require a hefty number of reloads. The controls can definitely be a major barrier to enjoyment until you get the hang of them. Combining tank controls with fast-paced action is difficult enough on its own, but throwing the real-time inventory scrolling in on top of that just made me a fumbling mess, until I replayed the first level a few times and got more used to them. The new re-release adds joystick movement to make things easier, but I chose to stick with the tank controls for this video because their restrictive nature adds an element of tension during encounters that I think the developers intended. With all that being said, I still managed to enjoy Fear Effect's gameplay. It's unforgiving, but I don't think unfair, usually. Some of the insta-kill traps are a bit too much. But otherwise, the combat in most traps test your reflexes and timing without a lot of room for error, but not in an insurmountable way. And the frustration I felt in some areas turned into satisfaction once I got past them and gradually grew more accustomed to what the game was throwing at me. The surprises and brutality really keep you on your toes while exploring, and even while watching cutscenes, since they can end abruptly with you in a nightmare scenario. The puzzles can be solved with logic and deduction and are generally well designed and complex enough to be gratifying to solve. Figuring out the right mechanics to take down bosses can be tedious if you have to reload several times, but once you do, you can usually make short work of them. There is one tactic I should mention that makes getting through some combat-heavy areas a lot easier. It does feel like an exploit, but it's really just too funny to want to criticize. The roll dodge maneuver is a good way to avoid enemy attacks and quickly reposition yourself in the heat of battle. But if you keep holding it, you can roll around indefinitely without taking damage and even just zip by enemies to your next objective. I haven't tested it myself, but I'm genuinely curious how far you can get in the game just by rolling. My guess is a pretty big chunk of it. When it comes to the story, the brutal action and flashy art style lay the foundation for a blockbuster-style action movie plot. With exciting dramatic sequences, a couple of over-the-top villains, random nudity, and a few well-placed one-liners.
I always thought you were bitch from hell.
Eventually, things become much more interesting as the plot gets infused with a heavy dose of Chinese mythology, and the characters are forced to confront demons from their past, both figuratively and literally. Despite being morally gray, the three main characters are likable enough thanks to their cool resolve in the face of danger, the way they look out for each other, and in Deke's case, some comic relief.
Looks like you've had a rough night, hey mate?
Of the three, Hannah is clearly the central protagonist. You spend the most time playing as her, and the plot delves way deeper into her character than the other two. The first thing teenage me might have noticed about her is that she spends a big chunk of the game running around half naked, since the plot oh so conveniently forces her into situations where this is apparently necessary. Like when zombie demons just so happen to attack right before she has time to change clothes, and when she has to infiltrate a brothel disguised as a prostitute. The latter scenario does sort of tie into an important revelation about her past, and the madam of the brothel becomes one of the game's primary antagonists. But regardless of any semi-relevance to the story, the pixelated eroticism made these segments kinda weird to play through. There is more to her character than this, though. The girl Wei Ming the mercenaries are trying to kidnap turns out to have serious issues. Like, real serious issues. As in, she accidentally turns people around her into bloodthirsty demons. She agrees to help the mercenaries get their ransom if they help her figure out what's wrong with her, which they oblige. Eventually, Hannah grows into the role of Wei Ming's protector, as the trauma of her own past motivates her to try and prevent similar damage from being inflicted on this seemingly innocent girl.
Let's get Deke and go!
I'm not leaving without her, Glass. I know what happens to girls here.
So we get Glass and bugger out then, eh?
Negative. We're gonna get Wei Ming first.
This is still business, right, love?
Not anymore, Deke.
It's a decent character arc, and the rest of the plot that unfolds around it is pretty good too, with some genuinely shocking moments involving important characters, a noticeable rise in tension leading up to the climax, and a nice instance of early game subterfuge that results in a twist at the end. But it's really the tie-ins with Chinese folklore that I enjoyed the most, and this comes to the forefront during the game's final act, when you venture into hell, literally. A hole opens up in the ground, and Hannah waltzes right down into the underworld. Up until this point, the three main areas you visited have all had strong artwork and potent atmospheres, which makes your journey through hell feel all the more impressive because it manages to outdo all of them. This isn't the fiery Christian version of hell usually depicted in Western media, but a cold, desolate afterlife where souls wait years or decades for an audience with the king of hell. Fire still plays an important role here though. Burnt paper offerings to the dead provide comfort for souls in the afterlife while they wait.
What is it?
Chinese superstition. They're offerings, gifts for the dead. When you burn these, whatever they represent is transported to them while they're waiting in hell to be judged.
This is cleverly woven into the gameplay by making the ammo, weapons, and items you find here made out of paper, which then need to be taken to a fire and burned before they can be used. And these offerings definitely do provide comfort, because as I'm sure you could guess, hell isn't exactly a safe and cheerful place to travel through. However, the pacing of enemy encounters does slow down a bit when you first arrive here, which is a little ironic since it's not until you make it to hell that you finally get a breather. You're sent off to explore and solve multiple parts of one big puzzle, and while doing so, Hannah interacts with Chinese mythological deities and confronts more elements of her past, both of which play out in a fantastically creepy manner. There were plenty of supernatural elements in the game before reaching hell, but nothing as surreal and mythical as this final expedition, which helps it feel climactic, and it's intriguing to see this kind of depiction of the afterlife, initially with all of its bleak and eerie landscapes, and then a kind of paper clockwork dreamscape that looks pretty mind-boggling. I was less impressed by the actual endings though, which there are technically 5 of. An important choice in the final moments involving 2 of the main characters determines who faces one of 2 possible final bosses. Then there are 2 endings for each character depending on whether you win or lose against said bosses. And none of them feel satisfying, which is actually intentional because the only way to get the true good ending is to beat the game on hard difficulty. That ending is better in the sense that things turn out much better for the characters, but the simple 1-minute cutscene it offers still doesn't really feel like an adequate reward for a tougher second playthrough. None of the differences between endings affect the sequel though, because it's actually a prequel. Fear Effect 2 Retro Helix came out almost exactly 1 year after the first game, and my thoughts on this one are a lot more mixed. Even saying mixed feels a little too generous because its final impression on me was a strong sense of disappointment and just exhaustion, despite being only a few hours longer than the first game, which was pretty short. But there were parts that I still enjoyed, and it did improve upon the original in a few areas, while also keeping many of the core elements that defined Fear Effect 1. So it definitely isn't all bad, but some of the design choices and most of the story just kinda drove me nuts. The second game is the more ambitious of the 2, and while it benefited from this in some ways, like improved visuals and some of its larger, more fleshed out environments, I also think that it hurt the game. Fear Effect 1's story was at times pretty insane, but still mostly well-paced and straightforward, with everything flowing cohesively from start to finish. Level design was tight and densely packed with enemies and obstacles, so that there was almost always something exciting or interesting happening at any given moment. The second game shifts away from this, except for the insane part, and the results were, in my opinion, not that great. I don't think the game begins poorly though, and I actually really enjoyed the first couple of hours. Like the first game, Retro Helix is packed with cutscenes, and the story starts with a cryptic, semi-philosophical opening where a harrowing experiment turns some unlucky person into the girl from The Ring. Then there's another cutscene after starting a new game, which shows slightly younger versions of the main cast from the first game. Deke must have cancelled his gym membership at some point between the two games because he's totally jacked here, and if it weren't for his over-the-top Australian accent, I wouldn't have recognized him at all.
No need to piss on me. The name's Jacob. Me mates call me Deke.
Look, Dick.
Deke.
Whatever.
So the opening premise appears to establish two things. One, there's a mysterious plot to uncover involving what seemed to be a biological experiment gone horribly wrong. And two, you'll learn more about the main characters' backstories and how and why they eventually team up for the events of the first game. Both the plot and the characters ended up disappointing me, but before I made it that far, the initial hook was strong enough to get me at least semi-excited about the story. The opening then shifts to Hannah and a new character named Rain doing a freelance job for a familiar face from the first game, which plays out in an underground aqueduct, a Christmas party, and science labs. These places and all other levels you visit throughout the game still use the FMV backgrounds and fixed camera angles, but this time the illustrations are more detailed and in many places much more vibrant than the first game, which generally had a darker, grungier tone. The cutscenes and character models look better too, and overall the unique visual design that was such a draw for the first game is turned up a notch and even better in the sequel. It just oozes atmosphere and style. As for the sound design, the music and ambient noise seemed more present and noticeable this time around, which when combined with the animated backgrounds helps make the world feel even more alive. The Christmas party you travel through near the beginning looks especially awesome, and so do some of the colorful late-game areas like these Chinese palace rooms. The environments are also closely tied to the gameplay. Levels are bigger, with a greater focus on exploration and environmental puzzles than the more combat-heavy first game. Mindless murder is still a big part of the game, but I wouldn't say it's the main focus. Fear Effect 1 was an action game with some puzzles. Fear Effect 2 is more of a puzzle game with some action. Three major differences from the first game stem from this. The game is a bit easier since enemy encounters aren't as constant, and because the traps aren't quite as brutal, thank God. It also has a much slower pace, and due to the nature of some of the puzzles, it eventually became more boring to slog through. Initially, I was intrigued by these changes though, and I didn't mind slowly working my way through the early levels because I thought I was progressing towards some kind of narrative payoff, and that these larger areas would have an important connection to the story or some sort of mystery to uncover. There were early signs of this too. A mysterious guy watching surveillance footage manipulates the environment by putting traps in front of you, and you stumble upon heaps of corpses and traumatized workers running around. Something sinister is definitely going on here. But then it turns out that the mysterious watcher behind the scenes who unleashed all of this carnage is just a mutated lunatic who rambles about kitties and has no narrative significance past the first level.
Nice kitty. I have a special kitty toy just for you, kitty.
After a very bizarre encounter with this nice fellow, Hannah and Rain make it out of the aqueducts and continue their mission to try and steal data containing DNA sequences, which they're doing just for money. There are occasional hints in-game of some greater backbone to the plot besides just doing random mercenary jobs, with very brief mentions of a global pandemic. But details about this pandemic and a coherent central conflict only actually reveal themselves in the player manual, which also oddly contains a pretty big spoiler. While you're actually playing though, the plot really just feels like a random sequence of events until the very end, when the game attempts to tie a bunch of earlier plot moments together. Things become even more convoluted when the story pivots away from the strictly science fiction segments in the first half of the game to Hannah's next job in a totally different area that favors more Chinese mysticism, like what was in the first game where you're back to chatting with ghosts and fighting demons. You spend so much time exploring the science labs and hunting for the DNA codes that it feels jarring for fantastical elements to swoop in like this, while science and reason are almost completely abandoned. If the characters had been done well, I probably could have overlooked the confusing plot, but unfortunately I think this fell short too. Learning why Hannah, Glass, and Deke eventually team up is put on hold for about the first half of the game, where instead the focus is just on Hannah and Rain, as you switch between controlling them while completing various objectives. This was a really good chance to add depth and create an interesting dynamic between them, because there is a bunch of back and forth banter that plays out through cutscenes. And they kinda almost pulled this off. They are protective of each other and have a few good lines together, but a lot of their dialogue also just seemed generic and shallow.
It'll take a few minutes to locate and deactivate the security video monitoring system.
Okay, I'll head to the 86th floor and wait for your signal.
This is my stop. Good luck, Hannah.
See you soon.
Rain, I'm inside the ventilation shaft on the 86th floor. Am I clear?
Not yet. I need a little more time to locate and deactivate the security systems.
Hurry! This vent is really cramping my style.
I found a way to the atrium. Give me a minute to get into gear. I'll join you at the party.
Good girl. Okay, here's the plan. The security guards must have access to the elevators. We just need to get close to one of them and snag a keycard.
They're all carrying weapon sensors. How can we get close without being detected?
Well, they can't have them on all the time. Let's split up and see if we can catch one of them on a break or something.
It's worth a shot.
There was clearly another strategy to get players invested in these characters, which was featured heavily in promotional ads for the game. There isn't actually a ton of this in the game, but still enough to make it obvious that they had the teenage demographic in their sights. When the main cats from the first game finally do meet up, you start switching between controlling them just like before. And from a narrative perspective, I felt like all three of them were less likable this time around, and lacked some of the interesting or redeeming qualities that made them decent anti-heroes in the first game. Hannah doesn't have a character arc like she did in the original, and is basically the same person from start to finish. Glass is perpetually glum and pissed off. Deke is a full-blown antagonist for most of the game, and despite working together sometimes out of necessity, they all pretty much hate each other's guts until the end.
You Yanks always so jumpy? We're all friends here.
I'm not your friend. Unprofessional, Hannah. You draw on me, you better be ready to pay the consequences.
Oh, but I'm always ready. Now, do you mind getting off me?
You do finally learn why they come together for the events of the first game, but the only significant backstory you get about any of them outside of their current predicament is during a flashback with Glass near the very end. This part was compelling and helped turn him into more of a sympathetic character, but by the time I actually got here, I was so disinterested in the rest of the story that I could barely bring myself to care. On a final note about the story, I should mention that despite how disappointed I was with most of it, the actual storytelling is impressive. The voice acting is pretty good, and the style and quality of the cutscenes were some of the best that any PlayStation game had to offer, and they still hold up well today. Combat is very similar to the first game, but with a few tweaks that I actually think made it better. More weapons were added, including high-powered guns like a grenade launcher and flamethrower. Were it not for the few moments of solace where I got to torch enemies alive to help deal with my frustration about the story and puzzles, I might not have even finished the game. But it was the addition of a couple more stealth-orientated weapons that I found the most useful. An EMP gun lets you freeze robots and zip right past them, and there's a rechargeable taser that can target multiple enemies at once, giving you a great option for both stealth kills and face-to-face combat, which can save you a lot of ammo for bosses and tougher fights. Load times were also made faster than the PlayStation version of the first game, so those frustrating moments where you have to reload half a dozen times after getting killed were less rage-inducing. Tough scenarios like that aren't non-existent here, but scaled back from what the first Fear Effect had. Oh, and the somersault trick was nerfed. Damn. A few special action sequences were sprinkled in that don't offer much gameplay-wise, but add a nice dose of spectacle. Running away from a horde of hungry rats, controlling a mech, and this chase sequence, which would have been a lot cooler if the game didn't make you go through the exact same thing twice with a second character. However, the majority of Fear Effect 2's gameplay is dominated by which deserve such a dramatic introduction, not because they're usually all that difficult, but because there are so many of them. In the first game, puzzles were spaced out enough that the pacing didn't suffer, and solving one usually felt meaningful because it meant that you were progressing to the next important part of the game. You get peppered with so many of these in the sequel that your reward for solving one is usually just having to solve another, sometimes immediately after. Individually, some of them are kind of fun, and there's decent variance while striking a nice balance of being challenging but not too hard. But from start to finish, the game is absolutely loaded with them, and the sheer amount just felt too tedious after a while and brought the game's pacing to almost a standstill. What's worse is the hefty number of environmental puzzles that sometimes send you running back and forth, and then back and forth a few more times to finally solve them. This is especially annoying when you have to go back through traps you've already completed or deal with respawning enemies. The strong atmosphere does help some of these segments feel a bit more tolerable, but not enough to avoid making them still feel like a slog. And during the late game, when their difficulty ramps up, I was just barely able to muster the patience to push through to the end. With all that said, I can still at least appreciate the developer's desire to go bigger and bolder with the sequel, even if a lot of the changes weren't to my liking, and I don't doubt that a ton of passion went into making this. It's a strange, flashy, and sometimes beautiful game. Like its predecessor, it sought to be daring and original in some ways, and all of these aspects did help make it at least interesting to look back on, although for me, just not as fun as the original. After the second game, the franchise's history starts to get really rocky. A third game titled Fear Effect Inferno was planned for the PS2, but later got cancelled. A wealth of footage, concept art, and even prototypes now exist online, suggesting that the project went through significant stages of development before it shut down. Years later, Fear Effect's publisher Eidos would eventually get taken over by Square Enix in 2009. If you by any chance saw my video on Anachronox, you might remember me mentioning the Square Enix Collective program, which offered indie developers the chance to develop games using former IPs. While Anachronox never ended up getting a spin-off game through this program, Fear Effect did. In 2018, the developers Sushi released Fear Effect Sedna, which I have not played, but even just glimpsing at footage is enough to tell that it's a very different kind of game from the originals. A remake of the first game called Fear Effect Reinvented was also in the works for a while, but after a turbulent development which involved switching developers, this too was eventually cancelled. So time hasn't exactly been very kind to fans of this franchise. I wouldn't expect the recent re-release of the first game to ignite a major resurgence for the IP, but it was just recently announced that the second game will also get a re-release in 2026. I would recommend the first game, but a bit cautiously. The innovative art style, atmospheric environments, fun story, and brutal action all work in sync to create an intense, memorable experience that stands apart even from the games that heavily inspired it. But it can get frustrating, and because of how unforgiving it is at times, it's not the kind of game that's going to work for everyone, unless you decide to just keep rolling.